Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for basically the inaugural episode or the first interview that I'm doing with Intuitive and Inspired. This is the launching of a podcast series where basically it's talking all about healthy relationships, discovering yourself through your own processes, through your own intuition, and connecting deeper with all of these facets of yourself. So I'm really excited to be here. Joining me today, I have an incredible person. I'm so excited that with me is Palveshey. I'm going to just start off by sharing a brief bio for Palveshey and talking about her experiences and what she's done. So, quantum physicist turned consciousness coach. Palveshey helps the greatest leaders from all walks of life cultivate joy and fulfillment from within while balancing their external worlds by helping them rewrite their stories. Most recently, Palveshey taught mindfulness to preschoolers in the South End, Boston, until she decided to shift her focus to adults. Previously, Palveshey served as an AI researcher at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and prior to this, she served as a lecturer at the University of Florida's World Bank program and as an adjunct lecturer at Harvard University. Palveshey has an exemplary academic background, ranging from graduate studies in financial technology from Harvard to postgraduate studies in quantum physics. She has taught subjects from blockchain technology to block universe theory, and after an extraordinary journey of her own, Palveshey has now geared her mission towards helping to spread consciousness and self-awareness. While Palveshey has received many accolades and built a heroic resume, ultimately the biggest challenges she has faced in her adult life are realizing that just a few years ago, she was nonetheless depressed, addicted to drugs, and unable to face severe trauma from her past as a homeless youth. Now, Palveshey is on a mission to help others do what she has done, take ownership of their life by transmuting their current pain, suffering, and limiting beliefs into positive energy. She believes that the most advanced technology in the world is the human body. And if it can be truly harnessed, a person can do anything that they set their sights on. In her free time, Palveshey is also the host of her own podcast called The Palveshey, which is incredible. And we have links to everything in the bio here. And she's writing a book on how to transcend trauma through exploring the intersection between quantum physics and metaphysics. So that is a whole lot just to get us started. And I'm incredibly excited again to have Palveshey here because we are just going to be diving into a lot of subjects, and we're going to be drawing through lines through all these subjects of our intuition, of consciousness, of decision making, and of ultimately relationships and how we relate to others and to ourselves. And so thank you so much for being here, Palveshey. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. This is going to be fun.
This is going to be really fun. It's going to be a great conversation. And so pretty much just to get us started, I wanted to go ahead and dive into the conversation of you and I had been having a lot of conversations recently in terms of conscious relationships. And one of the things that I thought was the most powerful about what you and I have talked about or spoken about is in terms of a lot of the times I think people get into, let's say, a romantic partnership, a relationship, a marriage, whatever the situation is. And our projection is, I would say, predominantly outward. So our projection is predominantly on that other person. Does that other person meet my needs? Do they meet my standards? Do they have the qualities that I'm looking for, right? Do they have these certain attractive factors that I seek in a partner, that I desire in a partner? And I wanted to ask about your perspective, and if you can share with us a bit about that perspective of how partnership reflects in consciousness and conscious partnership. How is our perspective then? Are we looking outward to the other person and the things that meet our standards and in terms of boundaries, right? Setting boundaries is basically protection of the self, saying, right, okay, I need to protect this. I need to protect these aspects of myself. Can you explain to me that perception on consciously relating?
Okay, you said a lot there. So,
Yeah,
all right. Let's see, where do we begin? Rarely do we actually know what we want or need. We can say that we want all of these things, make an entire list of like, these are all the things that I want in a relationship. But I think it's important to ask yourself, are you showing up and bringing the same stuff to the table that become the dream partner that you want to be, because that in itself will attract the same kind of partnership that you want. I would also like to differentiate between boundaries and fear, because you said boundaries are these things that we tend to set in order to protect ourselves. And Sure, I think that that can be true to some degree, but I think it's also important to know that and even be aware of when it's you're setting a boundary and when you're working from a place of fear.
So the energies that we see or feel predominantly in a relationship, I would say we can split them between, I feel energy of fear, like you said, or an energy of love. And so the energy of fear, we could say, is the energy that a person feels when they're closing off, right? When they're trying to protect, when their heart contracts, versus the energy of love, which is an openness and a trustingness or a feeling of trust. And it's almost like the
Mm.
opposite, right? So it's almost an experience of opening up. And so I wanted to ask then, because we're going to get pretty deep pretty quick here. Basically, instead of walking through like the step-by-step of connection and things like that, I want us to just dive right in, because I want to talk about then that, let's say, that delineation between, okay, a person could say, I am very mindful, I'm on this self-growth journey, and I learned about boundaries, right? I learned that I need to respect myself, stand up for myself, I need to set boundaries, I need to be clear, I need to communicate well. And so what's the relationship then between boundaries that are set from a place of, like you said, like, is it from a place of fear of, well, I need to protect myself because X, versus is that loving? Like, can that be a relation dynamic that is loving, or is that inherently based in fear?
Hmm. I think when setting boundaries, it's important to really reflect within and ask yourself, do I feel agitation within myself? Is that why I'm restricting my experiences?
I would say yes. Like, let's assume the answer is yes. I can use my personal experiences. Let's assume
and
it's yes. Yeah.
so in those moments, because yes, I've experienced that as well, and as you become more and more involved in growth mindset, you start asking yourself, okay, well, what am I doing right and what am I doing wrong, which are still man-made concepts. There's really no such thing as right or wrong, you're just changing direction. But yeah, in those moments when I find myself agitated, I'm like, oh, I don't ever want to talk to this person again. I ask myself, why is that? Why do I feel agitated? Because only I can make myself feel a certain way. Nobody else has the power to make me feel any type of way. So if I'm feeling agitated, what am I learning about myself? And to work through that rather than closing myself off and being like, you know what? I just don't ever want to be around this person again because they said this and they did this, or they behave like this, or their energy feels like this.
Mm-hmm.
Because really what's going on is that's a projection of yourself. Like, for anything that you view in the world that may bother you, it's also something that you have within yourself.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting concept, because I feel like, again, why I titled this subject conscious relationships, I feel like in a lot of relationship, let's say, advice or tips, things like that, I think that there's definitely a really strong emphasis on setting those boundaries. I do see that some of that can be rooted in fear, in terms of, well, I need to protect myself from X or Y or Z. And I wonder, in terms of going deeper, right? Taking that a level deeper, understanding, well, why is this agitating me? Why is this bothering me? Why might this be agitating or bothering me? The interesting concept is then taking that and using that as a way for growth, and not as a way of accidentally invalidating oneself, right? Or gaslighting oneself. So you and I have talked about this, and I really wanted to get into this subject during our time today, because that is a bit of a somersault. It's like a mental gymnastics that can be done, where you want to take ownership and take self-responsibility and understand why you're being triggered and validate your emotions and say, okay, I feel frustrated, let's say relationally speaking, by something that a person did or said, or a partner or spouse did or said. I'm feeling frustrated by it. I'm feeling bothered by it. And so how do I then, it's a process. How do I then take that and validate my frustration or anger, right, as valid, instead of accidentally brushing it off as, well, I shouldn't be upset about that, it's not a big deal, which is invalidating it or suppressing it. So acknowledging that, validating that, and then transmuting that without being a doormat, basically, or without accidentally letting yourself or letting oneself get walked on, by accidentally being like, no, it's fine, I'm at peace, right? I'm peaceful, I'm calm, I did my meditation. So that's the thing with boundaries, right? Boundaries are basically there to be like, okay, here are certain things that are acceptable, that are not acceptable. Does that question make sense? How can we do that then without accidentally maybe being a bit of a doormat for a partner or a person or a boss or whoever it is?
I think for me, it's been going into every situation with open curiosity. And I'll share an example from my own relationship, which I'm so grateful that my partner allows me to be so open and share examples.
Yes,
And
thank you.
um, early on, very early on in our relationship, before we really got a chance to know each other or even ourselves, because most of us tend to get into relationships this way. And
Yes.
I remember it was something very small. Maybe I was asking my partner to get something out of a cabinet, and they didn't listen. He didn't listen, and I said, I noticed that you never listen. And he responded with, no, 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 no. And in that moment, I was like, "Mm." And I got so upset. And I said, I want you to apologize to me. And he was like, no. And that bothered me even more. And I remember just sitting in silence on the couch, being like, I'm not going to talk to you until you apologize to me.
Right. And I feel like that's so common. I feel like that's a dynamic that a lot of people get stuck in. And that's why I'm pausing you, because I want to highlight that, right? It's like a gridlock where you're just like, I'm not going to back down because I don't want you to think that you can talk to me like that, right? Or that that's okay, or that's acceptable. Exactly. That's a perfect example.
Right. And then anger frustration begins to come
Frustration.
up, anger starts to come up.
Yeah.
And then that the ego that's holding on to wanting to win this fight begins to collude with the mind to create a whole story about how you're right and this person is wrong. And in those moments, it's for me, I prefer to just break that pattern and kind of talk to myself about what's really going on here. Why do you feel so agitated by words that were spoken to you? And for me, it was going back into patterns of, well, I was spoken to this way as a child. I was spoken this way in my studies and in experiences in the professional world as well. And it was part of that experience, that energy was coming up. It was triggered. And so I walked through myself through this, and I went through the process of telling myself, okay, it's time to let this go. How is this even serving you? And once I let it go, then I approached my partner again and explained to him, hey, so this is why I felt this way. Is there a reason why you felt the need to respond the way that you did? And as we went further and further, he also had reasons as to why he responded that way. And that was a moment where we grew together, where we dug into why we responded and reacted to each other that way. And that allowed us to move forward and change our relationship into a conscious partnership. That it was a solid, we were acting as a mirror for each other.
Absolutely. And that's a pretty amazing example. And going back to being stuck in that gridlock, right? I feel like a lot of maybe what's available now and a lot of things that are available now that are teaching about relational dynamics and especially about boundaries and asserting yourself. I think that is where that, again, that thing can be a bit unclear, a bit challenging, because it's almost that it feels maybe to the personality or to the ego, I don't know, or to the self, it almost feels like a failure to basically take a step down and say what you said in your situation, right? And so that was really the question. The question was for someone who struggles with self-assertion in a relationship, or maybe who struggles with self-esteem in a relationship or things like that, how to do that, but from an actually authentically empowered place. I'm asking because I think that for me, perhaps I was stuck in more of a perception of, well, in order for me to be empowered or feel empowered in a relationship, that would put me in that gridlock situation, and then I wouldn't back down, or I wouldn't feel comfortable backing down, because it would basically be like, well, you need to understand that you responding in that way to me was unacceptable, or I need to show that person that I would give them, whether it was a silent treatment or whatever it was, right, until that person apologized, which basically didn't happen, right? It wouldn't lead to an apology through doing that, or that wouldn't be a productive thing that would lead to an apology. And so I think that the question is I don't know if that makes sense. Do you see what I'm saying? How I would think that in order for me to self-empower, I have to not allow this dynamic to seem like I'm giving in or basically being like, oh, well, my reaction was thus because of this, right? Without, I don't know, it felt like folding, or it felt like a weakness, or it felt like, oh, I'm surrendering my power to this person and I'm basically taking ownership for this situation. And so it felt a little bit,
Yeah,
does that
because
make
it's
sense?
yes, so it's that to me sounds like the ego holding on for survival. That even the idea of the silent treatment, I mean, ask yourself, where did I learn that this was an appropriate reaction for this particular situation? Because these are,
Yeah.
to many of us, these are learned behaviors, either in our professional settings, in our personal settings, whether it was something that was practiced at home, whether it's something that we experienced in schools. It's all over the place. So, I mean, just a simple question like that, like, why do I feel like this is appropriate? This is an appropriate reaction. And at the end of it, when you do clear up all of these things, I find that we can't control external circumstances or people, but we can control
Right.
our reactions to everything. And in controlling our reactions to everything, that also changes the dynamic of how others react to us then. And in a way, that does allow us to control our external circumstances to some degree as well.
Yeah, that makes sense, because like you're saying, and again, being conscious in a relationship with whoever it is or in a dynamic with whoever it is, I think that when we were talking in the beginning about how a lot of the times we see things externally, right? In terms of, I want this person to do this specifically, or I want them to speak to me in a specific way. I want them to meet these specific requirements. And I think that, for using myself again as an example, one of the things that I struggled with for me was, I want certain, let's say, ways of communicating to be expressed like this, or I want certain things to be done like this because that's what works best for me. And to what you're saying about us working on internally, right, with those triggers, it almost sounds like that takes a bit of that and kind of turns it around. It almost sounds like that takes it and makes it more of, well, what is triggering you and what are the reasons that that's triggering you, maybe through a specific person, and through what ways are you consciously letting go of those triggers? And then therefore those triggers either don't show up as often, or what would that be the result?
Yes, because you're rewiring your neural pathways, that you're rewiring the way you react, and that's being stored as a memory in your mind and body now. So the next time a similar situation comes up, there's that memory of, you can either take the pathway of getting triggered, but now there's also a new pathway that's been created at least once before, and if you take that pathway, it'll become more and more solidified. I like to use the example of snow on a hill, that so many of our habit formations are as if snow fell on a hill, and when snow falls, we take sleds down that hill, and those sleds make grooves. Over time, what happens is certain grooves become deeper than others, and no matter where you go from that top of that hill, those deepest grooves will pull you in. These are your habit formations.
Right. And especially in terms of relational dynamics, I feel like those are where habits replay very strongly, because it's just a very intense and emotionally intense dynamic that you have with another human, especially if you're in a romantic relationship with that person. I feel like that is what most closely emulates the most primal lessons that we learned, and the most primal ways that we learned how to basically react under stress, how to react when triggered, how to deal with challenging situations. And yeah, I see that definitely coming up probably more in romantic relationships than in like a friendship, for example. I see that being a lot more deeply, almost automatic of a response, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because in romantic partnerships, you share so much more of yourself. There's also a physical relationship that's there, that really, there's a sense of vulnerability. And so that can easily create this expectation of, well, you know so much about me, you should know better than to treat me this way.
Yes,
Right.
Definitely.
Right. And so this is like an expectation, but this other person is also a whole little universe inside who had their own unique experiences that have led them to become the personality that they are, or the personality that has been developed, because they are not the personality. I want to differentiate that.
Yes, that they're
Personality.
expressing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so they also have their own set of triggers, their own perception. And so that's a huge responsibility, that this one person needs to know absolutely everything about you, and they should be a mind reader, and they should be an empath, and they should be just straight up magic. And that's just not how it happens. Nobody is perfect.
Yeah, I like the magic analogy. They should be magical. I thought of like a rainbow and leprechaun and unicorn kind of symbolizing magic. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that talking about that, what you were saying, segueing, I think that one of the things that maybe people struggle with, or people can struggle with, is similar to a conversation that you and I have had before, but it's going back to the subject of when we think about in a relationship and we think about looking at the person as a mirror, or understanding using that experience as a mirror for us and for ourselves. I think that maybe for someone, or for people or listeners who have had an experience of not being in a great relationship, for people who might have had, let's say, experience of being in an abusive relationship, or having had abusive experiences before, whether when they were younger or previously in different stages in their life. I wonder, for someone who has had that experience already, how to take what you're saying and not use it in a way that ends up becoming something along the lines of, oh, well, they're just a mirror to me. Does that make sense? If you're in a situation where there's something that's really not great happening with a dynamic or with a person, how to take that, and then what can that person then do, instead of using that almost as an explanation or justification of, well, this is my mirror, or maybe I deserve this. I don't know if, do you see that perspective more or less?
It's okay. So just to clarify, it sounds like what you're saying is that there's a sense of self-worth wrapped up in external validation.
I think that for most beings, there's that, that reflection of self-worth, coming from the person or coming from a partner. Mm-hmm.
Those can be very complicated situations, especially if you have a history of being in abusive relationships. I know that I was one of those people where I was constantly getting into the same cycles. And then at one point, I remember that I was like, next time I'm not going to be the one who's abused. And I wasn't. However, that pattern had been absorbed, and it showed up when I became the abuser in my next relationship. And that was very hard to come to terms with as well. That I told myself I wasn't going to do this, and yet that's exactly what ended up happening. And so to ask yourself, what's really going on here? Because the common denominator is you. And that can feel like, oh, I'm not valuing myself. But to some degree, that's the ego that doesn't want to admit what's going on, to see what's going on.
What would be that it's not seeing? What is it not seeing?
It may not be seeing the pattern that has been absorbed within you, and how it's being, how that same pattern is being expressed in your personality, subconsciously or unconsciously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
That's why I think it's so important to do the work on yourself beforehand, so that you have a sense, you have an idea of what your values are and why those are your values. Eckhart Tolle actually talks about this, that when one person becomes conscious or aware in a relationship, it's either that the other person also becomes conscious and aware, or it just doesn't work out.
Yeah, let's talk about that inflection point right there, where it's, or it just doesn't work out. How would a person, let's say, who is seeking to be in a conscious relationship or a conscious partnership, how would a person know, okay, here's a line that I'm ready and willing to cross, in terms of saying, okay, I did put in time and effort and it just didn't work out? versus, okay, I'm going to stay in the situation or with this person, and I'm going to continue to live these experiences and see if I can practice patience, see if I can be less triggered, see, right? Do you see? So what would that point be? Or how would one know that point?
I think when you're truly conscious and aware, there's a sense of intuition that also begins to arise. And your head and heart begin to speak with one voice rather than this constant duality of, well, I feel this way, and maybe I can compromise these values that mean a lot to me. That there's a sense of clarity that begins to form as awareness expands.
Okay. So there's a sense of clarity that begins to form when your head and your heart feel more aligned. I do see that there can be moments where someone can be more analytical and say, okay, well, logically speaking, this is what makes sense. This is what I think I should do, right? I think. And then maybe on the other hand, there's a more emotional side. There's a more emotional component of I feel, or this is how I feel. And then so talking about intuition and coming back to intuition, wanting to have those all aligned, what our intuition is saying, what our heart is saying, and even what our mind is either saying or projecting. Would you say that is intuition something separate from our thoughts or our feelings, or is intuition something that is a part of those or works with those?
For me, intuition is separate. It's a feeling. It's a feeling that allows me to make decisions and then engage with my emotions and my intellect consciously.
Okay. So intuition is basically at the depth of it, right? Intuition is the deepest part of it. And then I think a layer up are feelings. I feel this way. My heart feels this way. My body feels this way. And then on the most superficial or surface layer would be, oh, I think. So analytically, I'm thinking this, I'm thinking that, I'm calculating this. This is what would be a good option, right? Would you say those are the three layers? Like the most basic level or easiest level would be the mentally conceptualizing, then feeling in your body and your heart, and then actually listening to your intuition.
Are you proposing that it's like this order that you have to go through?
I actually don't know. That's more of a question. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it can be really, I think our mind likes to believe that it's all linear. And it may not necessarily be linear, but there is a point at which they can all become aligned. I usually notice that especially when there's a trigger, the feeling of agitation or frustration begins to arise and immediately follows mind activity. All of the justification as to why I should be feeling this way.
Yes.
And the more and more you clear those triggers, the clearer and clearer that channel becomes. And then your emotions aren't this thing that rule your life. In fact, you can feel your emotions just as you feel your intuition. And when you feel certain emotions, those are signals then, rather than this situation that you're dealing with. They're signals that work for you instead of against you.
Okay, so getting from that point, transitioning to that point where being able to use your emotions as your guiding signs, basically as signals, or noticing what's pointing you in what direction, right? Like a road sign, if you're driving down a road or a highway and you're trying to navigate yourself. So using emotions, you said, with intuition and being able to understand, okay, this is the direction that I'm going in. This is what I'm feeling in this situation, around this person, in this setting. How can I use that in order to guide myself? Understanding how to be able to reach that point as a person who can do that without necessarily acting on that or getting lost in that story. So for example, if we're going back to an example of a partnership or within relationship, right, we could say that example, that emotional trigger could be that frustration. And so it could be that frustration or that anger because someone said or did something that's not aligned, right? They said or did something that wasn't very nice, we could say, or it was just rude, or whatever it was not very considerate. And then I think that's where that emotion comes from, right? Wow, I feel really frustrated because they said or did something that was just not cool. And so the frustration is signaling then to us, right? It's basically signaling to us, hey, that doesn't align. I'm not down with that. Right? So it's like a map or a road sign signaling. So then at that point, we have that trigger, that signal, okay, now I feel frustrated. And so using that as guidance, or using that to guide, then it becomes, okay, now what do I do about this? I think that what most people do is, without understanding, they react. And so they go back on that person and they're like, you never do this, you did that is so inconsiderate, right? Or they just go into it or have at it with that person, right? I can't believe you spoke to me this way. What were you thinking, etc. And so I feel that a lot of people act or react from that really strong place of emotion, because they're like, okay, well, I have to say something because I'm feeling frustrated. And if I don't say something, this person will do it again, or they'll walk all over me, or whatever it is. And so you're talking actually about transmuting that, or taking that a level deeper, right? Not doing that.
Yes. So not doing that, but easier
Right.
said than done, right? So where do I begin? Because yes, you shared this story. At a certain point, there's this point of, this person said this to me, I feel something, and that's not cool. What a judgment. Where is this judgment coming from? If we just start asking ourselves these questions of like, well, where is this judgment coming from? Why don't I think it's cool? Why is this making me feel this way? Because so often we have these experiences in life, and then we apply perceptions to these experiences. And then that perception creates a belief system, which then attaches thoughts and feelings to those belief systems. And that unconsciously shows up in our behaviors and actions. But when you begin to go back to that original perception or experience and begin to question, like, why do I feel this way? Where is this frustration coming from? And one great example that's coming up for me on even practicing this skill is sit with yourself in silence. Is it really silent, or is there chatter going on in your mind? And if there's chatter going on in your mind, try to turn it off. And if you're having trouble turning it off, what are you feeling? Are you beginning to feel frustrated?
Yes.
So ask yourself these questions, and then ask yourself, why am I feeling frustrated? Is it because I feel like I can't control myself? And you begin to start exercising that muscle of just asking yourself these questions and essentially coaching yourself along the way. That, okay, so here's the issue that I've found in myself. And then, what's the goal? Like, this is where I'm at. Where do I want to be? What's the transformation? What's the end goal of this transformation that I'm looking for, or this awareness, or expanding this awareness? And then how will I know if I've been successful in achieving that? And why is this important to me? And what do I need to address or resolve in order to achieve the goal of this transformation?
Okay, so going with that point again, and taking this, and I'm going to be a bit persistent on this point. So then going with that point, right, for someone, again, speaking from my own personal experience, it's the only experience I have is my own. For someone who has had maybe, let's say, a challenging time with self-assertion or self-respect or things like that, for someone like myself who, let's say, has had a challenging time with setting maybe personal boundaries, maybe with self-respect, I had a bit of a hard time with that previously in earlier phases of my life. It wasn't necessarily very easy for me, or it didn't feel easy for me at a given time. And so I think that when something happens for me that is similar to the example that you shared, right, within a partnership, when something happens like that for me, the reaction is definitely frustration. So I feel a lot of frustration. I feel, probably that's the biggest word, it's either anger or frustration, where it's like, ugh, this is really frustrating. And so for me, what I end up doing then is I end up saying, okay, well, wow, this is like so meta. I end up saying, okay, so this happened, I felt frustrated, right? It's definitely directly correlated to, let's say, a partnership or a person, whoever the experience was with. It's correlated to what happened, to what they said, to what they did. And so there's that external component. It's not me sitting by myself or meditating and then I feel frustrated. I'm like, okay, I'm feeling frustrated. So there's an external component to it through a person. And so for me, what would end up happening would then be, okay, I see this thing, I experience this trigger. I have to then basically like fix that external component because I want to know that I'm going to be okay. And so for me, it was like what we were saying was hard because I was like, oh, well, what if someone actually says or does something that's really not okay? Right. Or says something that's just really, it's just out of line, you know? So that's just an example. What if someone says or does something that's just out of line? And instead of me going inwards and reflecting and being like, okay, why does this trigger me? Why does this hurt? Et cetera, et cetera. I think then I'd be like, okay, well, what do I do? Do you see what I'm saying? Or would I still take that inward?
I think it's important to take that inward first so that you at least have an idea of where you're coming from instead of immediately reacting. Because then you're engaging another person as well in your reaction, and they come with a whole set of their own circumstances.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So would you mind sharing a specific example?
Okay. So in terms of a specific example, I can think of, past ones. I can think of, let's say, like past experiences or something that had happened previously, however long ago. But let's say an example of, because for me, definitely it was that feeling. It was that feeling of frustration, of anger, and indignation almost. And so let's say there was an example of someone saying something along the lines of something that I maybe considered like not nice or rude. Maybe it was something that was said that just felt like it was hurtful or meant to be hurtful, or it was just poorly said, right? So maybe that could be an example of something coming out from the other person or the partner's mouth, and it was just something that because they were frustrated or they were feeling triggered and they said something, right, relating to, similar to your example. Let's use it like a general context similar to that, where the other person responds and it was just like rude, not nice, not great, not ideal. And so then for me, the immediate feeling would be frustration, and the feeling would be I need to express or show to this person why that's not okay, or I need to honor myself or set my own boundaries. And I think that came out, or that would come out as anger. So maybe that would come out as an angry response because I felt that there was like an attack. It felt like deflecting an attack. So you feel like you might be attacked and then you want to deflect that attack, right? And kind of like deflect that or push that back and be like, no. And basically put like a shield or deflect. And so for me, that would be my example. My example would be like, and I know that's not very specific, but it's like wanting to put up some type of a shield of no, I've been in situations before that weren't super great or super ideal. Therefore, I have a shield that I need to put up so that I don't get hurt, or so that I'm not being somehow, like I mentioned before, something like doormat, or like somehow put in situations where before or prior in former years of my life, I had been in situations that were more like being taken advantage of, or just not being self-loving or self-honoring, and the other person also not honoring me. And so when there was any minimal thing or anything at all that seemed like something that wasn't self-loving or honoring to myself, it would be a massive shield and a block that would just be like, nope, that would go up. And so then that would push that frustration, that anger, and be like, no, and give it back. And so reciprocate that and basically be, like you said, kind of like a gridlock, where it'd be like, no. Like, you don't get to do that, or you don't get to say that. And then the response from that would be anger and frustration back. And so it'd be a really intense cycle of two people in a dynamic where there's frustration or where there's anger or where it's kind of like feeding itself. And then one person doesn't want to back down, the other person doesn't want to back down, neither say sorry. And so eventually, maybe at some point, it would be like, okay, maybe I'll apologize, just so then that way we can kind of move on. And so it would just be like apology and then move on. And so that was the struggle that I was thinking of, the example I was thinking of when you were explaining that. Like
okay.
What to do.
So with everything you're saying, there's so many points in which we can dive a little deeper. And some particulars are like, well, so you said, I don't want to feel like a doormat because I've been there before. I think it's important to clarify to
Yeah.
yourself, what do you consider a doormat to be? And then, you said
Hmm.
I have self-love and self-respect. And so no, defense mode.
Yes.
I think it's important to clarify to yourself, what do you consider self-love and self-respect to be? Because these things look differently for everybody.
Hmm.
Boundaries look different for everybody.
Yeah, of
And
course.
so these are the moments in which you start really clarifying to yourself, wait, so why do I feel this way? Oh, because, I'm not going to be a doormat.
Hmm.
What does
Yeah.
that mean? What does that mean to you? And where's this need for assertion coming from? What happened? Where was that first point at which you felt this way in your life that it's showing back up now?
Oh yeah, I know exactly the point. I have it in my mind.
Yeah. So see, you have it in your mind.
Yeah, very
And so,
clear.
the point when you start asking yourself these questions, the point at which it began. And then, so to ask yourself, well, I'm not in that situation anymore. So why am I behaving this way now?
Okay.
That's a memory coming up.
Yeah, it's a memory, basically, like you're saying. It's a memory of feeling so, I think, in just disbelief of how massively I had, I don't even know how to say this. This is why the ownership thing is a little hard for me, of how massively I had let myself be not treated well or not treated kindly. I think it's just like some type of a genuine disbelief where it's like, wow. And like going very far back, right, to an original experience a long time ago. So maybe, oh my gosh, wow, over a decade ago, maybe like 15 years ago, maybe a while. And so going way back to that experience, right? And feelings of powerlessness, being younger, feelings of powerlessness. And so it's almost like there's such a, like you said, there's such a shield of I will not, or I shall not, in whatever dynamic. And even relationally speaking, it's like that those people bring those experiences right into their dynamic, into their relationship. And so for me, it almost puts up the shield of I absolutely shall not be in any situation that is even reminiscent of anything similar to backing down, similar to powerlessness, similar to me not being right, like in that power. So when you ask me that, that's exactly that moment of, like I said, like 14 or 15 years ago, that I was like, yeah, that was a moment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but true power isn't protection and defense mode. True power is openness.
Mm-hmm.
That and Because that defense mode is rooted in fear, which is the opposite
Yes.
of love.
Closing. It's closing because it's like I need to protect myself. And so
Right.
therefore I put up a shield. Yeah. And I think relational dynamics bring that out, like you said, because it's a person that knows you or that you know very well, or there's a lot of emotional intimacy you usually built up. Right. And so it's like it feels like a contraction, like you said, it feels like a closing, not
Mhm.
an opening.
Yeah. And then you begin to show up that way in all of your life and
Mm-hmm.
pretend like everything's okay. Everything's fine. I'm fine. Everything's fine. And yet deep down inside, you're scared and you're hurt and you're just trying to protect yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I had thought previously, I would think, okay, well, the answer is then to change or control or mitigate, right? Manage. I like that word. The answer is then to manage these things externally, right? Is to manage the things that I can control. And so I would try very intentionally or very hard to manage the things that were going on in other parts of the relationship and other dynamics and other parts of my life. So that way I would feel, or I could be able to feel like, okay, I feel safer. I don't feel like I have to protect as much because at least I know these things are manageable. I feel like I'm managing these things, right? Like you said, it then becomes a more of an external thing where there's that want to manage the external.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. That you're just trying to make sure you don't get hurt again.
Yeah, safe. It's like, I want to feel safe. Yeah, I want to feel safe. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But that comes from the inside, not the outside.
That sense of safety. comes from the inside, not from the outside.
No.
Mm-hmm.
Not in my experience, that when we genuinely begin to work through our triggers and release those emotional patterns, we actually become more and more confident in ourselves. It's like a credit system that we actually begin to build credit with ourselves. That no, the only thing, other people cannot hurt me because I won't allow it. And not allowing it doesn't necessarily mean defending yourself and like fighting back. Not allowing it could look like where someone says something to you and it doesn't affect you at all because you chose to not get hurt.
Yeah, that is that really, I feel like that ultimate component of conscious relationship, or being in a conscious relationship, especially, or a partnership with someone, or in a relationship with whoever, right? Whatever type of dynamic you have with a person that is close to you or a person that means a lot to you, is that point where, yeah, like you said, getting to that point where even if they have a moment where they're not saying something from their highest place or from their highest self, right, where you, based on your triggers, don't allow that to harm or hurt you, regardless of what they said, right? And that, I feel like that is, I think, more complex or transcending boundaries, because boundaries oftentimes can be things that I want to put in place because I need to feel safe. Because if my boundaries are crossed, I feel very unsafe, right? I feel just inherently unsafe because my boundary was crossed, or because a boundary was not respected. And so I would then take that, for example, or label that and be like, that's a toxic person. They don't respect my boundaries, or that is a toxic situation, whatever it is. It's like just taking that and labeling that or discarding that as toxic versus kind of going, like you said, which again, I think this is hard work, because that actually takes it deeper, and that takes it to a point of, okay, what inside you is putting up those boundaries in the first place? And what are the ways that you are actively being a participant in holding your own hand, and walking yourself through these more contentious points or through these more challenging points? And so for a final question, what would you say would be the role of the other person then, for anyone who is in a relationship or anyone who is with a partner or spouse? What then would you say would be the role of the other person in terms of these challenges or these triggers? Do you think that is an individual journey that you choose to embark on if you want to? The other person can do kind of as they want. The other person shows up for you. What's their role? Or do they not really have any responsibility in this anyway?
I think it depends on the kind of relationship that you've cultivated. Now, in certain my personal relationships, especially my romantic one, we've cultivated a relationship where yes, we do show up for each other. Was it that way always? No, not necessarily. That was, to a large degree, we do have our own separate journeys as well, that we are all learning through our experiences. And to really, it's part of why it's so important to clarify to yourself, well, what do I value? And like, who do I want to be? Where do I want life to go? Because then there will be certain experiences that happen. And if you feel a certain way, and you've done the work and your intuition's telling you something still feels off, at that point, you can begin to ask yourself questions like, well, is this experience bringing me closer to or further away from the kind of person I want to be? Because as much as there is free will, and as much as we would like to control everything around us, we can only control our own reactions. And there is an element of fate that we can't control everything.
Yeah. And I think that's it, right? It comes back to the ending point that you just said, because I think that maybe even for a lot of listeners, there's this idea that, well, when you meet, let's say the ideal person, the perfect person, whatever you want to call them, when you meet that person, it's a story or a narrative that I think we have, that there will be a sense of, I don't even know what to call it. I don't know if you would say certainty or intuition or what have you. And so I think that, at least, let's say, like, what's the common factor? Me, right? So my experience is, at least for me, what I would see is when those things would happen or when challenges would come up, for me, I'd be like, okay, well, this is clearly like an issue that this person is, I think, bringing with them, or that is coming up through this person, or with vis-a-vis this person, with this person. And so for me, the mentality was kind of like, okay, just, find a different situation, maybe transition to a next phase, transition to your next step, transition to another partnership or relationship, what have you. And so for me, that thought would be more or less of that, where it's like, okay, maybe it's time to, let's say, do whatever you need to do to go to a new chapter. And because I think that it's just been so strongly based on this narrative, right? That, oh, well, if a person is triggering these different things inside of me, or if a person is somehow pushing buttons or triggering, that to me was like indicative of, or I saw that as a sign of, okay, well, this is not for me, or this is not to be, if that makes sense. This is not meant to be, because there are triggers coming up, there are things happening, like my buttons are being pushed. And so for me, I was like, let me find a situation where either almost no triggers are happening, or my buttons are like very rarely being pushed. And so I wonder if other people have a narrative similar to that, or like what that narrative then ends up influencing in terms of us with our self growth journey, and also in relationships, if there is that narrative. And do you see what I'm saying in terms of like my perception, where I was like, oh, this clearly is like not meant to be, because triggers are coming up, right, left and right, or whatever it was.
So that's another thing, that I don't think the goal is to put yourself in situations where your buttons never get pushed. The goal is to get rid of the buttons.
That has been my like life objective, has been to find the situations where my buttons are not being pushed. Let me be super transparent with you, where you're like, that's not the goal. I was like, no, that's been my goal. That's my goal.
Yeah.
That was. Yep.
Well, that's protection. We're not really focusing on what's going on. Like, why are there so many buttons,
Okay. Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. About 2 years ago, or maybe 3 years ago at this point, I noticed, so I really did a pivot in my life. I changed everything. I left my home. I left my job. I left the city I was living in and just started over. I was like, why not? And part of that was because I was so unhappy and I was crying all the time. Then I move, and at first things are nice. New people, new place, even different temperature and weather. Yeah. But what I notice is I still feel unhappy. In fact, what I really noticed was, I was crying over everything. I had quite a few triggers. And at one point it occurred to me, wow, I cry daily. What's going on here?
Or at least multiple times a week, right?
Yeah.
A few times a week. Yeah.
And I remember one time, like, something small happened. I think it was my partner mentioned, hey, so you eat a lot of sugar. And that triggered me. That bothered me so much. He's like, I noticed you eat a lot of sugar. It feels
critical. Like, he's like judging you, and you're just like, whoa, hold on.
Yeah, but was it a judgment? He just made an observation, and I started crying, and I went down to our bedroom, and I just laid down in bed, and I started crying. And there was this whole story about how he judged me. It was his fault, and he should be kinder, and he should respect me. When really that observation he made was a life-changing one for me after that fact. Because I was eating a lot of sugar, and that's part of why it bothered me. Like, I had to like face that fact, and I didn't want to.
What? And okay. Right, because I would then go into this whole story about like, but it's my body, like you should respect my body. Sorry, not trying to sidetrack you. I'm already going on these stories.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, but like
how dare
he was respecting me. In fact, he was trying to show me that he loved me so much that he wanted me to take care of like my health. And I remember crying, and in that moment thinking, why am I crying right now? You can choose to stop crying right now and just get up. And it was really hard. But I did it. I stopped crying. I forced myself to stop crying. and really think about why this was bothering me. And ultimately, the answer was, it was bothering me because I didn't want to pay attention to it. I didn't want to pay attention to it because that would mean I would actually have to change something. And that it can be very difficult to do that. And I remember multiple times a situation happened where I started crying and then reminding myself, no, you can stop and actually sit and think about what's going on here. And after 2, 3 times, it started becoming a habit of mine. And I started crying less and less and less.
Yes.
And now, yeah, I don't really cry over small things, touching movies.
Right. Okay.
But that built a credit system with myself, reminding myself, oh, I'm showing up for myself, that even when it's hard, I show up for myself. And that also allowed me to have a conversation like, hey, what you said to me was actually very helpful. However, if we could communicate that in a different tone, that would be even more helpful as I go through this process of transformation. And that also began to transform our relationship.
I see that. Right. Okay. And so just using your example, sorry, go ahead.
The first step began with me. It didn't begin with, you need to stop talking to me that way.
Okay. Ooh, okay. Yeah. The first step. Right. Okay. Because just for example, like with what you just said, right? I was already going off in these directions of like, I can eat whatever I want, or it's my body, right? Just to, again, stick with this context, for me, it wasn't necessarily those same words hadn't been said to me. I haven't been in that same situation, but it's something that, for example, if it was in my relational or romantic context, I would definitely, let's say there was something that I would take as a judgment, right? And I would just go into this space of basically that, like, well, I can do what I want and it's my body, and how dare you think that you have the right to comment on whatever this or whatever that, like, no, it's not your place. And so the shield comes up like that, right? And so I don't know if those are similar things that you had felt in that moment when you were triggered by him, right? And that was so hurtful to you, and it felt hurtful, like you were being judged by a person you really care about. And then that brought up the crying and that brought up the emotions. For me, usually instead of the crying and the emotions, it would kind of push me into anger. And so I'd be like, ooh, right? And it would push me into some anger first. And so I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but it's like I connect with that example and I almost get a little frustrated hearing that example because I'm like, no, and it pushes me into that space, right? And so there I am, and I'm in this space where I'm like, no, it's your body, like, And so now it's like, okay, what do I do with this frustration? It's like feeling judged, not feeling happy about it. Let's say I'm in that space. Let's say I'm frustrated. Help, what now? Help, SOS.
In that moment of frustration?
Right now, yeah.
Mm-hmm. In order to completely, like, if you are able to, in that moment, I think getting just control of your breath. Box breathing, great tool that you inhale for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, exhale for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4. Just in that moment. Now we've gained some control over your physiology.
Yeah, words came out of that person's mouth, right? And I'm just like, ooh. The words just came out. They came at me. Oh, I'm feeling judged.
Yeah. Do it like 10 times. Do it like 10 times. It only takes about a minute to do. And take some space. Go reflect that. Because what used to happen was I would immediately go into defense mode, start crying, and then go take some time. I was like, well, if I reverse this order, perhaps we can skip the fight.
Yes, me too. It would be defense immediately. Like, you don't know. Those are fighting words, right?
Yeah. And then eventually, he grew too in that situation. It's those are the situations in which where I'm like, we act as a mirror for each other, that when at least if it's just one person goes and like reflects, then when you come back after reflecting and talk to each other, that's a growth opportunity for both of you. Because when I really reflected on what was going on there, it rooted in childhood. I remember being a little heavy in middle school. I remember adults around me, particularly male adults around me, telling me that I needed to be skinnier.
Exactly.
And
Commenting
that,
on your body like it's their
right,
business. Yeah.
right, or else nobody's going to want me. And so it was
Right.
tied up in this degree of self-worth and external validation, and all just a little kid inside trying to protect themselves.
Right.
And
Right.
now this situation showing up again and being triggered and be like, oh, you're doing the same thing. But it's like, no, in fact, that comment changed my life for the better, so much so that I use those same techniques to help people today now.
Yeah. And that's such a powerful example, like you're saying, because right, I'm just like, whoo, I'm integrating that, what you said, because I think that it is definitely, like you said, habitual defensiveness, anger or frustration, then tears or sadness, however that comes up for people. For some people that comes up as tears or crying or feeling really just oof. And then reflecting and deciding that like what that person said was so horrible and so judgmental and just so far out of line that I need to go and correct them and be like, you don't blah 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 blah, right? And it would just be this whole thing. It would
Yeah,
just become this whole thing, because then you're going up to the other person and you're just like, that is not how you speak to people. Like you have to be more sensitive, you have to be more caring, like you can't, right? Da, 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 da. That is not how you do it. Like even if you have a comment, and it would come from this place of me. Yeah, right, exactly, like in that situation, right, trying to affirm or assert myself and be like, you do not speak to me like that, or da 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 da, whatever, what have you. And what you're saying is very different from that. It's a very different take on that, and it's a very different step and sequence and process, where basically you're saying we're going to skip the immediate defensiveness and the immediate frustration and the tears, right, almost entirely skip through those, and we're going to go into self introspection right away,
yeah,
jumping those other hurdles.
yeah.
Right.
And this actually brings me back to what you said in the beginning of this podcast, is that how do you know that when to leave and when to stay and when you're being disrespected and when
Yes.
you're not? And the thing is, when you begin to have these conversations and nothing changes, you begin to know. But if things begin to change, then you begin to grow together.
So it's having these conversations from a more calm or grounded place, and
Yeah,
then seeing if that changes, versus having these conversations from a very angry or frustrated place of like, look, I don't like how you said that. That is unacceptable. Because
yeah,
when that would happen, those results would not occur. The other person would be like, well, if you don't like what I said, et cetera, et cetera, it wouldn't lead, let's say, to a change or to a result. So basically what you're saying is being able to have those conversations from that place after you did that process and after you reflected with yourself. And then if for whatever reason you've had those conversations and things still continued to not necessarily show an upward trend, or that person didn't necessarily show the ability to sit down and hear you and say, okay, and have those conversations with you, even after you work through the trigger, then that would be an indicator, versus trying to have that conversation through your trigger when you are triggered and saying, I'm really triggered right now, right? And I'm really frustrated right now, and I don't want you to speak to me like that. Is that
yeah,
correct?
yeah. And that, like, okay, tears might come up. I don't, and there's no need to, there's no reason to suppress them. That those are part of your emotions. That's part of the self acceptance process. But when I spoke to my partner, instead of being like, hey, okay, so I worked through this. In the future, I'd like you to not speak to me that way. You can sandwich it a little between like, hey, so what you said actually helped me quite a bit. It not just helped me in the sense that like it allowed me to explore a trigger, but it also allowed me to explore a new way of changing my lifestyle. That was extremely helpful. However, it would be great if we could have these moments of growth and opportunity without the tones and, like, I'm not, whatever reason you had for using that tone, perhaps you should explore that on your own. You know, it doesn't have to be this fight. And give them some time to change too. Give them some time to show that they listened. That's not just immediate.
Right. Habits take a little time to change.
Yeah.
Right. Ooh, wow. So much value packed into an incredible conversation. Wow. There's so much to think about here. And I know I'm going to replay this, and I'm definitely going to be integrating and just allowing things to sink deeper, and allowing that to, like process and take its time. So, wow. I just wanted to thank you so much for having this conversation with me, for showing up, for bringing your energy and your experiences into this sphere and speaking authentically from your experiences, from your challenges, from your growth points, from your inflection points, right? And not just speaking about all of this in theory, but actually speaking about it in actual practice, which I think is the most valuable part. And that is wonderful for me to share that with you and to hear this and to experience this with you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You're welcome. I loved it so much. And thank you to everyone who took time to show up today. Thank you so much for those who were able to tune in. Thank you so much for those of you who are listening to this who are able to join us live. I'm going to go ahead and wrap the Instagram live for now. But again, thank you so much to everyone. And I appreciate it. And I hope to catch everyone for an upcoming moment on a following Thursday.